The previous session, the question was, what can the global community do to enhance peace or bring peace to the Ukraine? The session before that was a broader one where we heard from some global leaders on that same topic. How do we promote democracy and peace? In this one, we've gathered colleagues from think tanks to think through the question with you. And I say with you because there should be still, there isn't a microphone, so I take that back. The question on what democracies can do to promote democracy, which we all see as an asset, perhaps even a global public good, from which we all benefit, but which might be under threat or at least under stress. There's conflict internationally, and what we ask ourselves is what can democratic countries do to decrease conflict and promote democracy. We have a set of speakers who will speak for about 7 minutes, no more each, and then others who will come in for about 2 or 3 minutes, and then we will have a discussion among ourselves about this. Genron NPO has been doing a survey on attitudes towards democracy for some time, and so I thought we'd begin by asking you, Kudo-san, to lead off, and then we'll go to the rest of our speakers.
Thank you very much. Thank you for allowing me to start once again. The survey of democracies, it has been conducted 10 years, not only in Japan, but across the world. We have been surveying and conducting analysis, and therefore I do have some observations. China and Russia are working together, and this is a battle against other democracies. So democracies versus autocracies, this I think is the trend of the 21st century. I think this is quite a strong trend, but that is not my position. So looking at the phenomena that might be the description of the current confrontation. So I acknowledge we might be trending towards or drifting towards, but that is not the fundamental dimension. So this is the kind of rhetoric, but I think this rhetoric will fixate and entrench this kind of viewpoint and confrontation. So what is the fundamental point? Across the world, the fundamental issue I observe is the legitimacy of the democracy. Legitimacy or not. Democracy means freedom, human rights, rule of law. These are what we ought to aspire or what we should value, not to be enforced by others, but voluntarily we want to defend, we want to advance, but voluntarily, not forced upon by others, because I think this is the asset that we have acquired as humankind. Unfortunately, democracy countries that supposed to embody these values, they are wavering. The normative important values, the democracies are not able to embody these ideals, which means the legitimacy of the democracies are questioned. That is my viewpoint. Then, democracies, they must make themselves legitimate about themselves. That, I think, is my recognition. How to be legitimate? Legitimacy. Who was legitimate so far? It was the United States. The United States has the power. It was indeed a leading player as democracy and was trusted. That is why there were many who listened to the voice of US. China might have power, but China's regime, do we all want to defend? Maybe not. Which means China is powerful, but it does not have legitimacy. But now the US, currently, by power and the legitimacy, it might be receding, and that is causing today's world. I inevitably have to think in this way. So what we were even surprised happened. That is when President Biden won the election. The Trump administration and the Trump supporters, they violently occupied the Capitol. This, of course, should not happen. There is freedom of speech. Many people might have different opinions, but they should not resort to violence to suppress the governance of the rule of law. That should not happen, but that happened. As we look back, there are quite a few such countries. According to discussions by survey organizations, the countries that have the form of democracies, I mean, so-called democracies, they could be variant forms of democracies, but the population is only 30% who live in something like democracies, and all of the population, 70% live in non-democracies. So the democratic formation is reorganized. Those who are elected by elections, in a sense, they govern, and in order to maintain their power and authority, they persecute freedom. So the form of democracy itself is questioned. Of course, it is true that the democracy is attacked. In the Philippines, during the presidential election, I spoke with the leader of political parties. In the internet world, fake news, disinformation that attacks democracies, it is conducted systematically. That is true. Within the internet world, there are emotional, ingratiatory tones that fetter the anxieties of the people. That is happening, it is true. The new world of speech, the world of internet, we must make it into a space where we resolve the issues rather than inflate, and we have not done that. And the authority of democracy cannot be protected within the world of internet. But the politics, it is already disconnected from the population. After the election, what the Biden administration is saying, Biden says that the utility of the democracy has to be restored and repaired. But the utility of democracy, is democracy really useful for the social stability? Is it useful for economic growth? Is it useful for people's welfare to protect human rights? The trust in a democracy means if the people living in democracy really believe that democracy is the regime that defend the lives of the people. Only when the population in democracies believe so, then they would be willing to protect democracy. But if that is not the case, then there will be questions whether we want to defend the democracy. And according to the results of a survey, and last year, when a survey was conducted over 55 countries, there were surprising results. Out of democratic countries across the world, most of the population are not suspicious about democracy per se, but they have a distrust about the governance under democracy, the election system, the political parties, the elected people, and to the government. Those are where they have distrust. In the case of Japan, Japan is considered to have a stable democracy, but the people of Japan, 70% think they cannot trust the politician to resolve challenges, and they cannot trust the Japanese parliament or the politicians. Or, in other words, only 30% trust. As a result, what has happened? Those who do not vote, more than half of the Japanese voters do not vote. This might apply to other democracies, but only half of the voters vote, which means only half of the people have chosen this governance. But how to create more people who feel a sense of ownership, how to spread the legitimacy. I spoke with Kihara Seiji. We spoke with Kihara Seiji yesterday. So the new capitalism advocated by Kishida administration, that is the revival of redistribution, and he talks about wage hike and others. But that is not the only vision of the Japanese government. Liberalism, democracy, those have to be underpinned by market, and the market should be changed. Today's market, whether it be about income, it's not only to allow a sufficient livelihood for all, but to maintain diversity and to connect with other liberal democracies. Such companies can be highly appreciated, and this applies to the global market. But that evaluation is required in the Japanese market and to Asia and to the region. They want to spread this vision to the region. Mr. Kishida has not specified so far, but now I understand, talking with Kihara-san, that Kishida is thinking that way. I don't know whether this will be realized, but the major challenge going forward, there are two. Number one, free trade and in free economy, not the loss of the middle class, but to spread the middle class and the foundation, to create a resilient democracy as the foundation, to stabilize social foundation, and to defend diversity, invest in people, invest in education, to enable the growth of a lot of population is required. And then the democracy will recover the foundation platform. But not only that, the population must feel the ownership, that the owner people must feel they want to improve the regime under democracies, and the population will have to be the owners of the reform. And there must be connection with resolving the challenges of all the world. Within a peaceful world, interconnection with the population of the other countries. This cycle is required. The challenge of democracies is not only about restoring resiliency of your own country, like what President Biden is saying, to recover the utility of democracy, but not only that, the foundation for freedom, foundation democracy, and linking many people across the world. And there are many people who have the same values in the global south and many in Asia. When war against Ukraine occurred, some people think that they are distant and far away, that it is not their war. But we must engage the people far away from Ukraine in order to strengthen the real foundation for democracy that will realize the stability of the world and the norms that we have to defend as humankind. We have to recover the legitimacy of the norm as we think is appropriate. And at least Genron NPO wants to aspire for these visions. Thank you.
To many of the points you made and you found in your survey, but it's striking how the world aspires to democracy, looks up to it, and yet is not impressed by its effectiveness often. And perhaps the two go hand in hand. Ong, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you. This issue of democracy always trouble many of us, because even in the developed Western society, there are different features of what is truly democratic and what is not so open and free. And then when you pitch it against the other part of the world, we come across debate about whether there is freedom of X or freedom of Y. So in our discussion, back in Singapore or in ASEAN circles, we have to ask ourselves what democracy actually means. How do we go about this? Because there are so many ways of defining the democratic practices in developed society. In America today, we in many parts of Southeast Asia look at what is happening in the United States with bewilderment. There is a guy who said that he should stay in power, and the election victory scored by the other side is not really a victory, and so on and so forth. So this really brings back to one fundamental point, which is how do the people believe in the democratic traditions or values that they have? And are these traditions and values something that all of us, whether in Singapore, in Southeast Asia, in Japan, in other parts of the world, can rely on and proceed on that basis? So we see people talking about liberal democracy and not so liberal democracy and debate from there. But to me, I think in contemporary times, these issues have reached a point where we reach a point where we have to ask ourselves the impact of internet, digitalization, and so on and so forth, and how can we understand this democratization process even better. So my main conclusion is that trust is important. Whatever system you have, people have to believe that whatever has been established to govern the country or govern the population and the society we have must be considered worthy and reliable enough to progress accordingly. So I don't know how to go about it in a systematic manner, just to say that, as I mentioned earlier, there will always be differences of opinion, but it doesn't mean that in country where you don't have the so-called features of a liberal democracy, it is less by the people. If you look at some countries in the world, we study a lot about Bhutan, which is a monarchy, but it is a place where you go by the polling, people are happy. So how do you explain that? And then when you look at other monarchy, yeah, there are other features which make people feel, well, the definition of democracy may be inadequate or overly extended. But I'm not here to debate all this. I'm just here to say that simply, yeah, at the end of the day, democracy or democratic governance really depend on how the individual population, individual societies see that their interests, their values have been secured by those people in charge. And if there is a lack of confidence in the people in charge, then there must be a process, orderly way to change the government and move on to the next bunch of people who can be entrusted to run the governance and the system in the country. So this is a thing of dilemma that we have to go through. But for the purpose of today's discussion, I think, as I mentioned earlier, in the earlier session, there will always be two points of view, and it's how we look at each other and ask how we can accommodate differences in our views and, for that matter, in our community and our nations. And then if there is utter disagreement, how do we reconcile and move on? So my earlier point has been that institution will be critical, yeah, and hopefully this kind of institution, whether internally in our country or overseas, out of the country, among the international global community, will help to stabilize the kind of opinions and differences which will inevitably be always there. Thank you.
No, that's a good point. I mean, through political history, I guess the case can be made, and I think you just made it, Ong, that voice and representation and legitimacy can come through different political systems. And elections, as we see them, might be neither necessary nor sufficient condition for them. And there are others who think that they're certainly a necessary, but no one thinks it's a sufficient condition for democracy. Carlos, your turn. You need a microphone.
It's difficult to define democracy in the world environment because there are so many forms. But I would say that you can define what is not a democracy. If you don't have freedom of speech, of course subjected to speaking the truth, okay, or what you believe it's the truth. If you don't have a freedom of speech, then you don't have a democracy. If you don't have a right to dissent, then you don't have a democracy. If you don't vote for your leaders, you are not a participant directly or indirectly on the choice of the people that are going to govern the country, then you don't have a democracy. But even if you put all that together, democracy is more, okay? Because democracy has an aspect which is how are the decisions regarding the allocation of governmental resources, regarding the execution of public policies going to be taken and executed. So, in a true democracy, if you want to raise taxes, is not a simple matter. If you want to issue new debt, then you have to go to the parliament. So some countries don't have that. Others have more. A good budgetary process is part of a democracy. And this is very important because choices and the mechanism through which you make those choices is very important. I don't believe in direct democracy like the Greeks have had. So I don't believe that every time that you have to choose something, we will meet at the Agora and vote for that. No, you have your representatives and they are empowered to make choices for you. It's an imperfect system, but it's the best one that we've got. So the difficult thing is, how are you going to promote consensus on the system? And the answer to that question is, you are not going to promote consensus, not absolute consensus. You are going to reduce the set of things that you don't know if you agree or you don't agree, which is the worst possible situation. If we agree about something, okay, let us do it. If we don't agree, but it's clear what we don't agree, maybe we can bargain and come to an agreement. But if I don't know if we have an agreement or not, because we don't know if we are agreeing, sometimes we don't even know if we are talking about the same subject. So this is a complication. So democracy is not only a set of rights, it's a framework of governance for solving dissent. And of course, this is done in Parliament, this is done in the judiciary, it's partly, and to a smaller part, by the executive power. Montesquieu invented the separation of powers for some reason. If you read his book on the reasons for the decline and fall of the Romans, then you see the explanation for the esprit de loi, the spirit of laws, is there. It was a Roman example, but it's not the only possible example. And we have had an evolution that is very important. We have to remember that Napoleon was defeated at Waterloo by Wellington because the British had a parliament that voted the debt to finance the war, and the members voted the taxes to pay for that debt, and the members of the parliament were amongst those that were buying that debt. So it was a very trustable thing. Britain had credit. Napoleon, on the other hand, was not a democrat, and all the credibility of his government depended on him winning a battle after another. And people were saying one day he's going to lose a battle, so his credit was diminishing. Napoleon could have had an army 3 times bigger than he had at Waterloo, and then he would have won. But he didn't. So democracy is much more than simply going to the corner of a street and speaking badly about the president or the prime minister, or saying, I want to vote, and then after I vote, I don't do anything, I don't pay attention to what my representatives are doing, I don't question them, I don't talk to them. No, democracy is also a state of mind, a state of spirit, and you have to fight for it. Democratic countries may be indifferent to the war in Ukraine. They may be for a quick solution. There is a tremendous array of possibilities. But one thing is true. They don't accept the idea of reducing liberty. in general, they don't accept. It's not good. They consider this because the public opinion is very important in a democracy. And of course, today, with transversal communication that we are having, this thing is upside down because the traditional media has somehow collapsed, changed, and we have all this Facebooks, TikToks, Instagrams, etc., and we see it's a new world coming. I don't know what's going to happen with democracy afterwards, but I bet it will survive.
So you mentioned citizen engagement, the role of the media, and the need to fight for democracy. And so I do want to bring the discussion to, one level down, if I may, to something pragmatic. So Creon and Paul and so on, over to you. But do think also about what existing democracies might do to actively promote democracy. I can't think of, there's the G7, but it excludes some major democracies. There's the G20 that includes non-democracies. There have been proposals for the D10. Britain's been part of that. But think also about the ways, the mechanisms in which we can more actively promote democracy, if indeed you believe that.
Well, thank you. Well, I mean, this is absolutely fascinating. I learned a great deal about a particular period in British history. But so I will reverse actually the way I was going to speak. So I'll start with what I hope are two quite pragmatic approaches whereby existing democracies can either strengthen their own democracy or democracy in the world as a whole. And on the first, I think one of the most important things that democracies can do is, and it's something the UK did in 2016 with an anti-corruption summit, a bilateral anti-corruption summit, which was very much focused on the wider world. And it was really all the things that the developed countries could do alongside governments in the developing world who were keen to improve governance to reinforce their efforts to improve governance by controlling money laundering, by strengthening actions on kleptocrats. I mean, we've seen, for example, in the context of Ukraine, all of a sudden the West has discovered another 1,500 people who could be subject to sanctions, whether for corruption or for supporting Putin. So I think one area that the West can do a great deal in is to continue the effort in not, if you like, providing facilities for people like the president of Syria or whatever to put away money in accounts overseas and so forth. Second point really is about what you can do internally. And I think each country, in a sense, has its own both specific challenges, but also responses. So in the case of the UK, we have a very strong tradition of regulating public television. So all our public television has to be neutral, whether it's commercial or public. And it's always puzzled me why that wasn't a simple extension to say, okay, we're going to apply the same approach to the internet. Now that may be coming now because we're having new regulatory approaches, and I think increasingly there's a recognition that the approach that the UK has taken since the 30s needs now to be applied in a broader space. But that's a good example of something that is very specific to the UK. In other countries, it might be much harder. In the US, with the freedom of speech in the Constitution, it's extremely hard to do something similar. There may have to be a different approach there. The other thing I wanted actually to focus on, which was another question in this session, which is what efforts should democracies take to prevent further global division? And I really wanted to come back to what William Hague had said this morning with sort of 5 really quite pragmatic steps. So he was absolutely right. The first thing we have to recognize is that we are not in the world we thought we might be in terms of convergent systems. We have major problems, and countries which are democracies are going to have to cooperate with countries that are not to tackle those problems. So how do you do that? I think first and foremost, you recognize that reality and you are very honest with your publics that that's the reality you're in. The second thing is I think you very clearly need to think through what the priorities are in terms of global challenges that need an approach that spans both democratic and non-democratic systems. So climate change, preventing future pandemics, debt distress, nuclear weapons would be my set. But you also need to think very carefully about how you're going to go about it. Because, for example, in the area of climate change, there are a number of proposals out there which would try and mix together the issue of dealing with debt distress with the issue of providing new finance for developing countries that are facing climate challenges. And yet all the analysis suggests, particularly when you're dealing with China, that this will actually make it a lot harder, not simpler. China is relatively positive about green finance. It's very hard work in terms of debt restructuring. So you need to think that through. Third point, as I've mentioned, is you need to explain to your publics exactly what you're doing and why you're doing it. And then I think the fourth point, which is kind of very relevant to the Japanese G7 coming up, it's very important for the like-minded countries, as far as they possibly can, to coordinate the approach, if you like, to coordinate the offer they make to the wider world, specifically to China, on some of these issues. So when it comes to debt distress, we've talked a lot about strengthening the common framework, but actually it's very important to put tackling debt distress into the broader context of tackling the development finance challenges of the low-income countries and middle-income countries. And in a sense, once you have an offer to make, and not a naive offer, but a clear offer, then you have a much better chance of carrying it through in that dialogue. And then my final point really is about the institutions. I mean, I do think that the institutions we had after the Second World War are very rare because we don't, it's very hard to create institutions like the IMF, the World Bank, that have the kind of legal structures that they have. Particularly the IMF is a very good example of an institution that was actually created to work with both democracies and non-democracies, has quite specific legal strengths. It has the ability, for example, to create special drawing rights, which you've seen, how powerful a tool that can be. What we need to do is to make the most of these institutions, because it's going to be very, very hard to create new institutions of that kind in the kind of geopolitical environment we're in now. And I think and I think we also need to be careful not to be mesmerized, if you like, by big, new, wonderful ideas, which are actually very impractical to implement, and make the most of the existing techniques. And this is very true, for example, of development finance from the World Bank. The actual original concept is a very good one, that you raise, you have shareholder capital from the wider world, you raise finance on the markets, and then you use that finance not to make a loss, as a gift, but basically to fund things that are really essential. And in the case of climate adaptation and climate mitigation, that's really, really, really important. So while there are other ways of doing it, let's not forget that there is actually a very traditional way of doing it. I'll stop.
I think the other thing that's often been said of democracies, and William Hague made that point in the context of the last couple of years of politics in the UK, is that they may go astray, but then they have the capacity to self-correct. And I think some people make that point about the US as well, that it went through a Trump era and then in some sense has self-corrected. Perhaps not definitively, but it has. And dictatorships find it more difficult to identify the problem, have people speak truth to power and actually self-correct. And we might want to come back to that one as well.
You could say the UK went through a self-correction this autumn, actually, in terms of... So we had a government that actually was not viable. It didn't last very long. We have now a government, as William Hague says, which is actually far more traditional, very pragmatic, very focused on addressing what the problems are and finding solutions to them in a way that perhaps we haven't had for the last 2 or 3 years.
Mm-hmm. Paul.
Thank you, Chair. I'm going to try to combine 4 concepts here that I think we're all woven into the topic. Democracy, globalization in the broad sense, not just economic, digitization, and then international cooperation. And starting with democracy, I would agree on the point that the representativeness of the people, the the will of the people ultimately is the true test of a legitimate democratic regime. One of the interesting things about that is whether or not there's an ability to test that as true or not. And I think that, to me, that comes down to be one of the most fundamental things. Maybe the Russians, to take a recent example, support the war in Ukraine, but do we really know? Is there an ability in that non-democratic system for that to come out? So I think the other point I would make that was noted about how democracy evolves is, that things change quickly. There's no one-size-fits-all. And I think we might want to get ready for even more radical thinking. It was mentioned earlier today in the speeches about the new generation, and what do they think? And we're probably not very representative of that new generation here. So for a moment, I'll live vicariously through my teenagers. And they are already living about half of the time in the metaverse, right? Which, I don't want to sound like some kind of techno-topian, but things do change very quickly, right? And there's a whole new structure that's emerging, and there could be surprises for the way that these things evolve, and potentially some positives, right? About how do you have your pulse on the people, as elected politicians and things like that. So there may be some nuggets of positive things coming for democracy on technology, and I'm going to talk about some of the challenges in a moment. What does that boil down to combine with strategy for the G7 and others? I don't think democracy is the frame, is the focus, is the organizing principle to drive international cooperation. But I do think that the Japan new capitalism model is very much needed in each one of the G7 countries. I can't think of any one of them that does not need their own form of that. There's a lot of similarities between them, and I think they're all doing some of that, right? So that is the thing that's going to strengthen democracy. Next point on globalization, and quickly here to stress one point, but I will say that what I noted down for globalization is the following: that economic globalization gave huge benefits, but also did not solve the inequality issue. In fact, it made it worse in most cases. And this is universally true of not only the G7 countries, but the entire G20. Inequality in India and China has gotten worse within the country. Between countries, it's actually tended towards some little convergence. Now, Europe is relatively stable, but inequality has still eroded, right? So globalization has not delivered on inequality. We heard about climate change a lot today. I would broaden that out to say global ecosystem disruption across the board. And that's not just climate change or even biodiversity, it's the oceans. And this is an issue that is absolutely fundamental to the way forward. And then two final things. One, that the multipolarity is there, just simply based on the economics, demographics, even the security military apparatus. I mean, the countries that are up here looking, Brazil and India, are full-fledged powerhouses in the multipolar world, even if they haven't fully figured out exactly how they want to play in that world. The final point is the revolution across most areas of science and technology to the point where we're not recognizing those changes. And I think a lot of that is driven by digitization and data, and is now being augmented by supercomputer power that can use those data sets and artificial intelligence in ways that are changing, as we see, virtually by the week. And should quantum computers and other things come into that mix, again, we're going to see some very, very significant changes. And the examples I would point to there, it was also mentioned today, TikTok, Facebook. I think there's an exponentiality element here that has not been faced very often in history in the true globalized sense of when a change occurs, it can literally happen in days or weeks or hours at an exponential rate and have global impacts, right? So TikTok came out of nowhere very quickly and has become a global force that has, the whole debate around, is it good, is it bad, should it be, should it stop for security reasons, or is it really about competition? Putting those aside, it scaled up at a rate that has not been seen, right, and became a global force. Silicon Valley Bank that I mentioned earlier, there was attempted transactions of $42 billion of withdrawals in less than 24 hours. Not all of those were successful, but that was enabled by a digital system that was not in place before. So you've now got digitized bank runs that are taking place. My final point would be to say for the G7 leadership, I think it's logical that there would be core priorities like Ukraine being part of the G7 agenda. It's obvious. But the question is, what else should the G7 take leadership on? Climate change was mentioned many times. I think that makes sense. But it has to be something that bridges to the G20, I would say, as the next step, and then beyond. There has to be a set of these are G7 priorities that we want to extend out. And I would put technology in that sphere, information, how data is managed, rules around digitization. I think artificial intelligence is the perfect candidate for the G7 to say, okay, what are our views on this? What are the common interests? What does the G20 think about that? And then where do we build from there? Because in the absence of those kind of leadership moments for the G7, these issues will just swirl around in the competitive space. Thanks.
That's a very interesting thought to sort of use new technologies as the entry point for democracies to shape the global discussion. Tori.
I would like to make a couple of comments, but let me first try to just come back to one of the questions you asked. So the format of the cooperation groups. And perhaps we should not forget that at a certain point the G7 became the G8 with the inclusion of Russia. So at that time, I think a serious effort was made to include, to facilitate the inclusion of Russia in the cooperation frameworks, together with also a decision to set up the NATO-Russia Council and other measures. So one can conclude, of course, that this was a mistake and we should have been more cautious in opening to a country with which we could have difficulty in cooperating and whose evolution was not clear. But I would also draw another lesson that it's important, indeed, it's worth, these efforts are worth undertaking when we see that there is an opportunity to increase cooperation in a country whose evolution seems to be positive. So that's the spirit in general I would advocate in discussing this possibility of enlarging those formats. I have a general, I will also add follow-up on what Paul said on globalization. I fully agree, of course, that these the globalization processes have caused big inequalities with many repercussions on the political system, including the rise of populist movements. But there is also a general problem, which is closely connected, of course, that there is a sense that the government has somewhat lost control on the dynamics, the economic dynamics, are not able to govern those dynamics. This is also an additional problem we face. The general consideration I would make is that indeed, of course, the democracy is in crisis, and this is shown by all indexes and reports we see, although probably the trend in the last couple of years has not deepened so much because there are positive cases. But as a matter of fact, we see many negative phenomena in our countries, the low electoral turnout, also the decline in trust in institutions, and the rise of populist movement. But at the same time, we have a problem of some countries promoting different model of governance, and this effort is underpinned by their influence. In the case of Russia, of course, the military support Russia is providing to some countries, but even more important, of course, the economic leverage that China has acquired and their massive overseas investment. Of course, the important thing, in perhaps rather than promoting a precise model of governance, an alternative one, they are trying to discredit as much as possible the Western democratic system by highlighting some structural shortcomings of our system, and also some dramatic events, of course, such as the assault on the Capitol Hill. And also the idea that the democracy can have different meanings, essentially by dismissing the basic principles of the rule of law, which is the basis, indeed, of democracy. So that's a real challenge. But that said, I would emphasize another very important point, which is the output legitimacy for us. We have seen that when, and this is very important at time of crisis, when governments are able to respond effectively to crisis, there is a rise in the trust of the population. During the early stage of the pandemic, for instance, Europe was unable to act collectively. This caused a sharp decline in the first half of 2020 in the European Union. When the European Union managed to create new instruments for support to the population and also to act collectively, there was a remarkable rebound. So the problem is collective action. Try to have solid instruments for collective action, try to consolidate the collective instruments we have to foster collective action. A final point, we should not underestimate some intertwining between geopolitics and the evolution of the domestic system of countries. So, of course, for some time, the European Union has pursued a policy of democracy promotion, in fact. Then it abandoned this policy because it failed miserably in its neighborhood, particularly in the south. But you have seen the European flags waved in Moldova, in Chisinau, and also in Georgia, in Tbilisi. So this means that in any case, the European Union or the democratic system does have a pull of attraction. And in case of Europe, this tug of war between the European Union and Russia goes even beyond Ukraine. And in fact, Ukraine all started with Euro-Maidan protest, and this is very important to know. So in any case, there could be several cases, and we have already several cases in Europe, in the former Soviet countries, where there could be an effort to change democratically the country from the bottom. Grassroots movements then also can appeal to us, in the case of the Eastern Europe, to the European Union. And this poses, of course, another challenge that we should not underestimate.
Thomas, I suspect you may have thoughts, particularly on the European side, but which are the institutions we have that can sort of fight for democracy and promote it actively rather than react to attacks to it?
Well,
Very briefly, I don't know if we have some institution, but maybe one thing which could be useful is to share a common reading of the evolution of democracy. It's not a historical perspective I would elaborate on, but maybe a quick reminder that, for instance, we had the so-called Orange Revolution in Ukraine in 2003. And during this phase of democracy promotion, very supported by the Bush administration, I would say that democracy was on the offensive side. We had the so-called Color Revolution in the post-Soviet space. After that, we have the so-called Arab Spring. And the turning point is certainly, 2011, 2012 with Syria and the reverse effects. Since that, democracy seems to be much more on the defensive position. It was transformed in many countries, sort of illiberalism. Within the EU, for instance, in the US with the Trump election and its consequences, the Brexit, Prime Minister Johnson. Things can be said about, evolution in Israel, in India. So I think that it's important to see that now democracy seems more on the defensive side than previously. That leads me to point out maybe a contradiction on which we should think about. I don't know if there are institutions able to deal with this contradiction to respond to a question or intern, but it is, in Europe in particular, the declining participation to elections. So that leads to a question about how do we educate the youth in particular to contribute to the political life when political parties are less and less popular. And on the opposite, and that's why the point made by Paul and the one you have underlined, the importance of technology seems to me absolutely crucial. The increasing empowerment, personal empowerment through technologies and the ability for everyone to become a sort of media. So to some extent, we are less and less able to produce representation and more able to produce discourse. So that's maybe the big difference. Discourse, the production of discourse, consistent production of discourse at each level, at many levels, are becoming to some extent, the characteristic of democracy, which lead to this key notion, which was mentioned a couple of times since the beginning of the Tokyo Conference, of freedom of speech.
I'm glad you mentioned the youth, because one thing I've heard, I don't know about France, but certainly in Canada and the US, that the way civics is taught in schools, if at all, is not the way it used to be. And so there's a role that the education system plays in this. And we often neglect domestic education policy, which is the building block for openness and democracy. Sanjay.
Thanks, Rohinton. Very, very interesting question. And that is also, I think, linked to the more fundamental question about what do we mean when we talk about free speech? It's a fundamental question. Is it about coherence in social discourse when you talk of the limits of free speech, or is it about the importance of dissent in public discourse? Now, democracies often grapple with that situation. They grapple with it because you say that there have to be certain limits on free speech, especially when you get into the world of technology. When you say that certain people perhaps need to be debarred from expressing themselves, when you look at your Twitter feed, that they should not be there at all, they should not be expressing their opinions. See, eventually what makes a democracy is the fact of institutions. And we must understand, what does institutions mean? It means that there has to be separation of powers which creates clear arbiters of what is free speech and what is not free speech. Independent institutions which do it. And this is a process which is a negotiated process. And democracies many times slide across the scale. Sometimes they get better, sometimes they get worse. Now, where youth are concerned, see, today the big question arises when we talk of education, we start talking of youth. Youth today have modes of expressing themselves which many of us did not have in our youth. They come forward. They do express themselves in many ways. And it is impossible to suppress the methods by which they express themselves. And that is a question when you start looking at so many countries which are not democracies. I mean, I've traveled in the last few months a lot to West Asia. And I was actually surprised by the vibrancy of the debates and discussions taking place between these young men and women creating startups, getting into the technology space, the kind of debates they're having amongst themselves. Sometimes those debates are not taking place in some of the most coherent democracies. So no, this is a complex question. It is related to questions of education. It's related to questions of building capabilities within our youth. Are we building those capabilities? Are we training them sufficiently to understand what is happening in the world of technology, understanding what is happening in the world of communication? There are gaps even in the best democracies. So this becomes a rather complicated spectrum. Humpty Dumpty said, when you use a word like maybe democracy, you can take it to mean many, many things. And that is a question, I think, when we start discussing the impact of technology, that question is being faced by many countries. What is the debate about what is data privacy? Does data privacy mean what privacy used to mean in the old world? I don't think it does anymore, because each one of us is radiating data every moment of our lives. Not radiating, I would say excreting data. It is so much waste data we're excreting, which is of value to somebody, which is going to be used by somebody. So democracies then got caught up in this question of who is controlling whose data, who is using whose data, and these debates are not yet getting settled. And I think these debates are going to get more and more important in the time to come.
Jim.
I think it's pretty clear that we have a crisis of democracy. It's not to the same degree. It's not necessarily happening anywhere. But there's enough out there to trouble. Kudo-san at the beginning quoted a number of poll results for Japan. I will note that you can find similar findings in many countries around the world. Simply right now, surveying the politics of many established institutionalized democracies, countries are clearly troubled. Mine, the United States of America, perhaps at the forefront in terms of the bitterness of the political debate, the degree of polarization. I think if you were to try to come up with a list of causes for this, it's probably quite long. I would imagine that almost everyone's list would have globalization and social media. Globalization because it increased inequality, as I believe Paul mentioned, hollowed out certain parts of the economy. You can see that if you go to the upper Midwest of the United States or the north of England or the north of France. At the same time with social media, has contributed to the polarization, allowed for the spread of disinformation and misinformation. It's hard for democracies to function when the simple question of what's a fact is being disputed. And I note all of this because I'm old enough to remember when our expectations were that globalization and social media were going to be the good disruptions. Globalization was going to bring us all together and give us the opportunity to make more money. Social media was going to allow us to connect, to share, to inform, and it can do that. And I say all this because I'm now looking at what seems to me to be another coming disruption that may dwarf all the disruptions that have come before it, and that's artificial intelligence. It is being perfected at a degree which I think surprises even its proponents. There's no regulation on it, and I'm not even sure that even the people who make it understand it, and I just don't know how it is going to interact with everything we see in democracy. Second point I would make is to go back to where we began, and with Kudo-san and yourself, Rohinton, talking about the success of the United States, the appeal of values. But I think the appeal of democracy isn't or never has simply been one of, it gives me voice. The sense was it worked. It delivered goods, partly because it reflected the needs of people, partly because you could course correct. And I think in many advanced democracies over the last 2 decades, many people, not just young people, and I don't want to throw young people under the bus, because it can be older people who should know better, who can misuse technology in ways that are destructive or corrosive to the fundamentals of a democracy. But what has happened is that there's a sense that democracy is not working. I'll just look again in my country where what has become common is people go out and they vote for change. And you see big swings from election to election, yet clearly people feel that that is not delivering any result. It's as if the lever's broken. You pull it, you vote, you're voting for change, and then things pretty much continue the same way. I think this is something, again, third point, looking at the Biden administration in the United States. They're hoping to break through. We've talked about the new capitalism of Prime Minister Kishida. I think the Biden administration is hoping that its success over the past year and a half with things like the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, the Science and Chip Act, what it will end up doing is rejuvenating the American economy, delivering benefits for the American middle class, and that will change the tone and tenor of politics in the United States. I hope President Biden is right in that bet. I'm not necessarily convinced he is right, because one of the interesting things, and I'll speak only about the United States, is that there's a disconnect between what happens and who is perceived as getting credit for it. Again, if you look at the public opinion polling in the United States, what's remarkable is that, for all intents and purposes, Republican-leaning voters and Republicans don't want to give President Biden credit for anything. And they believe that the economy is much worse off than it is objectively. And so you run the very risk where you could actually have policies that are successful. And I will note that these are policies that Republicans pretty much opposed across the board, and not at the end of the day get any credit for it. Indeed, a lot of the American political debate isn't over economic issues at all. They're over issues of identity, over who America is and who it represents. And I think that can be very difficult to put back together. I'll just close by going back to the question of, what can established democracies do to help fledgling democracies or fragile democracies or aspiring democracies succeed. And I think the biggest thing they can do is show the right example. Show that not only does democracy embed or have values you might aspire to, but it actually leads to results that are good for the people living in those societies.
Thank you. And Stefan, before we end this round, in the next one, as we move to the 6:30, I want us to zero in on exactly what Jim just said, which is our first guiding question is what effort should be made, I assume proactively and explicitly, by democracies to prevent further global division. So if we all agree that the world is moving in the wrong direction, what can democracies do specifically to make it a better place? But Stefan, you finish off this round.
I would like to pick up where Jim ended, because I'm also quite skeptical what democracy promotion in other countries can achieve. I was personally involved in several democracy promotion projects in the 90s in sub-Saharan Africa. And when I look back at that time when the wave of democracy captured the continent, we only have meaningful elections right now in those countries where we had also a strong pro-democracy movement on the ground, and not in those in which we tried to establish democracy by external pressure and coercion. I think when you go through the countries, you can easily prove this case. So we have to think, or we have to accept that there will remain systemic differences in the world, that we can't change it or only partly change it from the outside, and that we have to deal with these differences. I think the most effective way of democracy promotion, this was mentioned by Jim, is to make our democracies more attractive and prove that they can deliver. And here I agree with Ettore that the most important element is to improve on the output legitimacy of democracy. And I'm quite optimistic that we can do so, because I think when you look at what we have achieved in Europe, Ettore, in the past years in dealing with many crises, be it the euro crisis, the migration crisis, the pandemic we have right now. In all these crises, we had difficult starts, but we improved during the crisis, and I think that the balance is not the worst. And the reason for that was also mentioned in the beginning, that democracies have the capability to correct themselves. And I think this is, from my point of view, the element which makes me more optimistic about the fate of democracies than of autocracies.
And thank you for raising that point, because I do think democracies demonstrating by good acts is an important symbolic and effective move. And the example I'd give is from what many of you have raised, which is new technologies and data, is Europe's GDPR, European Union's GDPR, is actually the gold standard, and countries across the world sort of recognize that. States in the US aspire to it, even if the overall national regime isn't there. And one can make the case that that is a manifestation of how a democracy deals with new technologies. So in this round, and please spend no more than 2 minutes, because we do want to end on time, give us your sort of 1 or 2 specific thoughts or proposals, and of course some of you have already done it, but you might want to underline them, on what democracies can actively do, and I'll start with you, Kudo-san, to decrease conflict in the world or make the world more democratic and transparent. Start with you.
Thank you. Democracy. I'm thinking, as I think about the situation in Japan, as Jim Lindsay said, I was very convinced the stabilizing factor is globalization and social media. They destabilize the world. But there is another. The mechanism, the cycle of problem solving is not working. Inherently, democracy is that people go to vote and elect a politician where there is a challenge, and when there is a support, there will be cycles of solving the issues. But this cycle is not working, not only about the protection of your country, but there are global issues of climate change and many others. The cycle of solving the problem, these are supposed to link your country with the region and the world. So first of all, democratic states, they must have their own cycle of resolving the issues. The politics, political party, the parliament or the diet, the political systems have to have a cycle of resolving the issues. There's the role of the media and the role of the academia and the researchers. There must be debates of the think tanks like we are doing. But I think this might be unique to Japan. But as I observe Japan, as Mr. Lindsay said, social division can be observed by the poll and survey. But more troubling is many people say they don't know, they do not have a clear opinion. The Japanese younger generation, do you think democracy is important? I don't know. More than 50 say they do not know, or they do not have an opinion, or they do not understand whether it's yes or no. The function, opportunity, the platform to think on their own, such opportunities itself are being lost. Within the internet, in a space, such a space of internet replaces the function of what they think on their own. The trust in the political system, the cycle of solving the issue is not working in Japan. There must be lots of conversation, dialogue between the people. Sometimes we visit university and we want to talk about a campus for democracy. We have to try once again to make the discussion vibrant and noisy, and then going back to the global world, in order to resolve the challenges, the world seriously has to work together. Otherwise, we cannot solve the issues. Democracies must have a cycle of resolving the challenges, and the democracies must play a leading role. So when there are global challenges, even if solution cannot be found, at least the issues must be clarified and the overall direction must be presented to the global community. If we can get together and discuss together, I'm sure a new flow will start. Within the Japanese society, a lottery democracy is a terminology used. The politics discussed and vote at the parliament on the one hand, and deciding by lottery is it not the same outcome? So that is the strong distrust in politics. And this does show another dimension of democracy. A democratic society is supposed to self-determine. That is, AI or collective autocracy, to depend on others, to depend your fate on others. That is not democracy. Ownership is important. The sovereign people's position is important. It's difficult to be democratic. But the ownership of the people, the real sovereignty of the people has to be restored. For that, the elite, academia, researcher, media's roles are infinitely large. Thank you.
Thank you. I prepared for this conference by reading the speech of Japanese Prime Minister on new capitalism. And from there, it reminded me of the need for social inclusion and how do we connect people both in the companies, in our private life, and in civil service, in government agency. So the point that I would suggest is that this may be the time for democracy to think about really going out to connect and to be inclusive. And what we need to do is to work through our respective country system to bring about that social cohesion and inclusiveness. How that is done depends on each of our own society's characteristics and features as well as the institution involved.
Yeah, well put. Carlos.
Well, I think that the original theme of this session is how democracies can promote the end of a war in Ukraine and so forth. Democracies, how they can promote the emergence of other democracies, and that's where I'm going to fix my attention. I think that there is a major point that is often ignored. All the good actions that have been talked about, they need money. And right now, the democratic coalition is not, I mean, the United States and the others in the G7, it's not on a good shape. Now, this is a weak point. Lots of good intentions, but democracy won't be promoted around the world without money, without incentives. And in order to fix this, you have to do something which is very, very, very difficult. You have to convince public opinion that the priority is not to recover their purchasing power, but to invest in the development of our democracies. Is it possible? I think it is, but it's much more complicated than people think. There are two coalitions in the world. One is China plus Russia. which is easy to sustain for China, and the other one is more complicated. It's the United States plus a series of countries, and all of them, including the US, have a big financial problem in the loom. So you have to fix that. Democracy also depends on finances.
Creon.
Thank you. Well, I covered this to some extent in my first comments. I guess one thing I wanted to come back to is the concept I described was really one of carving out certain issues in which the democracies would try very actively to work with non-democracies to come up with global solutions. And in a way, I think we don't know to what extent, for example, China is ready to carve things out, as if China is one of the main counterparts. You know, this in the past, perhaps there has not been much evidence that they would be willing to. They would like to see things, you know, to look in every bucket at the same time as in relation to a particular dispute. But I do think there is a. It's very hard to see of any other way that the world can tackle issues like climate change, global health threats, unless, if you like, both sides are willing to carve something out and say, look, we will tackle that. We will each preserve our own values, our own approaches, but on certain things we will cooperate together. So I think the question in my mind is, what is the diplomatic approach that would enable us to get into that space on a limited number, but a really crucial set of issues. Thank you.
Paul?
2 points. The first one is on just when we say the democracies, I think what we really mean is leadership from a subset of democracies, because it's not about speaking with one voice, in my mind. It's about the ability of democracies to take leadership in ways which is much more difficult for autocracies, because they don't have the creative ability to kind of work on issues in some ways. Now, they if allowed to do so, they can, but they don't spontaneously, have think tanks and other mechanisms to kind of come up with good ideas. So I think there really is a leadership opportunity there. I think the G7 is the starting point, but it has to bridge to the point that was just made, to the reality of climate change being a global issue. Can't stop democracies, won't solve it. Second point is on how do we institutionalize this going forward? It seems to me that right now the mechanisms are not working very well on the common issues. When the G7 gets together, it does talk about global issues of common interest, but it tends to kind of say, well, we don't have all the pieces here, so let's focus on other issues. The G20 is not talking about really anything in a very constructive way. Could India, as the chair this year for the G20, launch an annual policy dialogue that is not controlled by governments, dictated by the latest political priorities, and kind of come up with an annual list of the common interest themes and a bit of a report card on how we're doing on those. And the G7 could have a role in making that happen.
Tori.
So I understand that there are at least 2 points of consensus among us. First, that was right to abandon the ill-conceived democracy promotion policies simply because they failed miserably. The second point, which is not less important, is that in any case, democratic systems may be a source of inspiration for other countries. And to do that, it would be important to reform and preserve them, starting, and I agree with this point, with renewing the social contract and implementing policies to improve especially the conditions, the life conditions of the poorest and the most disadvantaged. Of course, at the same time, we should, as much as possible, try to preserve the acquisitions, long-lasting acquisition, including some rights of the freedom of speech. And I agree it's really important to concentrate also the new challenges, for instance, the management of data, etc., the protection of privacy. But when journalists are arrested, you have, of course, a big problem to deal with. Second point, very briefly, simply, it's very important to devise a strategy at the global level, concentrating on the global commons, where all major actors are substantial stakes. And just let me again list the issues that have been discussed today: trade, climate change, outer space, maritime security. So there are many global commons where there are already discussion, arms control probably. There are discussions how to improve, have new agreements, and try to have common rules. So these are certainly the fields on which it is worth concentrating.
Tom? Sanjay?
Thanks, Rohinton. Briefly, see, we are still going to be living in a more and more competitive world. It's going to become more competitive, not less. And the acid test for democracies is really going to be that within this competitive world, how do you stay ahead in the race, to innovate, to create prosperity through innovation, and better distribute that prosperity? And that is where the China model versus the democratic model, the autocratic model, which has many adherents and many admirers across the world, comes into play. Now, better distribution does not really mean distribution within the country. That better distribution means intra-country distribution as well. Now, can democracies succeed in both? Now, how does the new capitalism do it? That is going to be a big question which is going to be asked. Because the other model is still today talking of globalization through a very different methodology. The BRI was a primary plank of that globalization. It has modified, it has changed, but that still goes on steamrolling and moving ahead in a much modified manner. And for democracies, it is going to remain a challenge. So these are the three things really: to innovate, to create prosperity through innovation, and better distribute that prosperity, which democracies have not been very good at.
Yeah, it goes back to Carlos's point about the finance as well. Jim.
Trying to get our wires untangled. Let me make three quick points. The first one is just to echo what has been said on the panel here today. We don't have the ability to promote or create democracies elsewhere. A country's political evolution is shaped largely by events within that society, and the ability of outsiders to come in and sort of change the course of direction is quite limited. Two, that doesn't mean there's nothing that we can do. And here I think one needs to draw a distinction between countries that are aspiring to be democratic versus countries that are seeing democratic values eroding. Countries that are aspiring to become democratic, established democracies, can do a lot to help them, doing things like providing support for political parties, for providing for election security and election observers, and you can do a lot of things to facilitate trust within countries. In terms of democratic backsliding, that becomes much more problematic, in part because any attempt to intervene or criticize the government that is moving backwards can basically be used against those people in that society who are most concerned about democratic erosion. And I will just note the EU has been troubled over the years by the democratic backsliding and political evolution or de-evolution in Hungary, a country which it has some leverage over, and Mr. Orban has been very successful in using those criticisms basically to enhance his support at home. And we could replicate that example over and over again, which puts, I think, leaders of democracies, established democracies, in a very difficult position, which is you are going to get pushed to take a stand, to criticize countries who are becoming less democratic. But the very act of doing that could basically make the problem worse. So you then have to find that fine balance in which you can potentially speak privately or behind the scenes to try to make a difference. That may be more effective, it may not, but it also runs the political risk that you get criticized at home for not standing up and pointing out the shortcomings of another country, which can become politically dangerous for your own chances.
Stefan.
Yeah, my remark is very short, but unfortunately also very abstract. What can democracies do? They can develop solutions to problems by political discourse and then offer the solutions to others. That's what we can contribute, I think, to global challenges.
Thank you all. No, I mean, the reason we had this discussion is there were no easy answers. If there were, we wouldn't be sitting here talking about it. But I thought there was a lot of hope at the end as well, but a lot of introspection in the sense that the best things democracies can do is demonstrate how well they work. And if they're not working well, redouble efforts to prove that they are working well. So I think there's lessons for us as democracies, and then there's lessons for others who aspire to be democracies. For that, I thank you all. And with this, I bring this session to a close and turn it back to our friends at Genron.
Could I just interject 1 minute, Rohinton? I just want to thank you for your excellent moderating. You've done it a couple of times today. I want to make sure you get some applause.
Thank you.